am Ever, and this will be the 10th chapter of His Leading Light by Emotional Logic on AR3, and the chapter is named The Implications. Summary. Nezu get to watch our little green bean break in 4K. Well, not really. The video quality on the security cameras are trash, and you two favorite faculty members get some more insight on the situation. Looking at the text he'd just gotten from Nezu, Shoda didn't answer. He just walked out of the classroom with a dismissive comment about how the class rep was responsible until another teacher arrived, sending a quick text to Nemori, who he knew didn't have a class this period, to cover his class. And then he went straight to the principal's office to relay what little he knew and demanded to know what Nezu had figured out. It was a short walk, but it was also way too long for Shoto's liking. He walked into the office looking stressed and impatient, and it must have been obvious because, for once, the rat didn't wait for him to speak first. He did, however, wait until Shota had sat down and the door behind him had closed, before doing anything. When he did, he didn't speak. Instead, Nezu simply turned his computer screen towards Shota before pushing play on a video that seemed to be a compilation of CCTV footage clipped together side by side in a way that when someone walked out of frame in one, they would simply turn up in the other, either immediately or at most after a few seconds. Shota watched as a whole bunch of middle schoolers came into frame, able to deduce that the school gate was most likely just out of frame, given the way that they were all walking. He wasn't quite sure what he was watching or why, but it most likely had been to do something with Midoriya, and now that he had thought about it, they were all wearing the same middle school uniform the kid had been wearing, if just more neat versions. He continued watching as the students became fewer and further in between until the last student had left. There was no trace of Midoriya anywhere, and Shota looked over at Nezu with a raised eyebrow in a silent question of, what's the point of this? But Nezu simply looked pointlessly back at the screen as the footage started spinning up slightly for a couple of seconds, before going back to normal just in time for a familiar head of grinning curls to enter the frame. Shota had to steel himself at the sight of the kid. How broken he looked, how hesitant and slow he was walking. For the first time, Shota looked at the timestamp, and his heart broke a bit, seeing that this was hours before he met the kid, knowing that this was what the kid looked before his meeting with the hero would somehow manage to look at this and decide to break him even more. He continued watching the video as Midoriya continued walking, the speed increasing slowly the more he walked, but never really shaking the bone-tired hopelessness he seemed to be carrying in his steps. After some time of just watching the kid walk around, he watched him enter an underpass and had to take at the fact that the kid didn't seem to come out at the other side at the time that he had assumed he would, by taking into account the average size of an underpass and the pace the kid was walking at. After a moment of nothing, Shota turned to look at Nezu with his brow furrowed, only to be met with the rat looking back at him and in anticipation, looking like he was waiting to see how Shota was going to react at the next part. It sent warning bells up Shota's spine, but he reluctantly went back to watching the video. Something was going to happen there soon, and Shota was going to have a reaction to it, and knowing what he already knew, he was certain the reaction wasn't to be anything good. Only a few seconds later, he was proven right. Shota all but leaped from his seat at the shock of seeing the kid unconscious, being thrown out of the underpass, skidding to a stop on the pavement, just laying there. He turned back to Nezu, not bothering at all to hide the anger he was feeling, and he was rightfully met by the principal looking very much not pleased with the situation. Yet the non-verbal message he got remained the same as last time. Stay seated and watch. So he sat back and he watched. He knew logically that this had all taken place before he had met the kid. This wasn't happening right now, and so there was nothing he could do to help the situation. That didn't make it any easier to deal with the way his quirk immediately activated a red glare, all but piercing the screen, the second All Might, of all people, walked into the frame. And started hitting the unconscious kid laying on the ground. He continued watching the video until it was over, until the screen went black, until he managed to get control of his quirk again. He took a deep, staggering, controlled breath and closed his eyes to rein himself in just a bit before opening them and glaring at Nezu, as if the rat was the sole reason evil existed in the world. What was that? It wasn't a question, not really. They both knew what it was, and they both knew how little they could actually do about it. Had it been any other hero, anyone else, Shota would already be on his merry way over to hammer their head into the nearest wall. But this was All Might, the number one hero, the symbol of peace, a pillar of society in such a way that tearing him down without taking proper precautions would all but crumble the whole country. And thus, all Shota could do was glare. And that's exactly what he was doing, glaring. And waiting for Nezu to answer the question he already knew the answer to. Of course, Nezu knew that he already knew the answer to the question, and also knew that it would do neither of them any good to dwell on it when there were far more urgent and pressing matters at hand. And so, instead of answering, Nezu simply ignored the question and started talking as if it had never been posed. Now, from what you told me earlier today, we know that after this, All Might took off with our Midori-kun to the rooftop when you ended up finding him. Nezu was tapping away at his keyboard again, the video gone from the screen, and in its place several different maps and videos that seemed to be the live streaming on different TV cameras. The footage changed rapidly between different places while Nezu was talking. Unfortunately, I can see them when All Might makes the jump, and so I can only make a slightly educated guess as to which area they might have landed in. This time, Nezu looked over at him, giving a pointed look, saying something along the lines of, "You should know the rest, but I'm going to say it anyway. So, if you happen to know the address of the building, or at the very least can narrow it down to a smaller area, that would be much appreciated." He ended it with a polite smile that Shota knew to mean, "Give it to me, or else." And for a moment he slightly regretted coming to the office instead of just sending the address over the text like he was asked. He didn't have the address memorized or anything, but going on the Maps app on his phone, it didn't take long to find a hospital he'd taken Midoriya to, and from there it was easy enough to backtrack from there. He managed to narrow it down to 3 buildings that were all tall enough in about the area it would have been, and relayed that to the rat as he found it. It took not even a minute before the CCTV of 2 of the rooftops were on camera. The third didn't have cameras, and Shota was able to pinpoint which one it was by the railing. He could see the way the boy had crawled over that railing so clearly in his mind. In a minute, Nezu had 2 different angles of the footage of that roof, as the neighboring roof had apparently covered the other roof quite well. Nezu zoomed in on the second one so that it only showed the rooftop they were interested in, and then he made them both start simultaneously at the exact time step they seen All Might and Midoriya disappear out of frame by the underpass. Sure enough, barely a half minute later, they saw All Might land on the rooftop with Midoriya landing in a heap of nerves, catching his breath on the roof. It looked like All Might started saying something as he walked towards the railing, and Nezu perked up a bit with a quiet but enthusiastic, "Oh, maybe," followed by a couple keystrokes. "Gonna have to leave now." All Might's voice came through the speakers of the computer, and Shota once again felt his anger boil up. If he was being honest with himself, it hadn't actually left, and the anger he was feeling now was likely out of proportion, built up from the day's accumulated stress and irritation. Knowing this, however, didn't make him any less angry at the way the number 1 hero was about to just leave this child on a rooftop nearly a few minutes after the same kid had been lying unconscious on the ground. "Oh my, please, wait! I just need to ask you one question. I need to know." The kid's voice was rough and sounded beat up, which made sense given how he had just been choked unconscious by a villain. But it made the hero stop walking away long enough for the kid to ask the rest of his question. "I need to know, if I don't have a quirk, can I still be a hero? Is it possible even if I'm quirkless?" The first part of the question had been screamed out so loud that it took a moment before Shota's brain caught up and caught the quiet ending. And oh, Midoriya had told him that he'd ask All Might a question, and that he gotten the answer he knew he was going to get. That he had hoped to be proven wrong. Shota didn't need to listen to the video to know All Might's answer. He already knew it, though he continued to listen to it as Midoriya continued to explain himself. He was ranting, and his voice was filled with so much raw, broken hope that Shota couldn't understand how anyone could do anything but answer the question with, "Of course you can." Nezu suddenly stopped the video in what seemed to be the middle of Midoriya's rant and turned to Shota. The principal was looking serious, and Shota was about to open his mouth to talk, but was cut off by a raised paw. "What you're about to see does not leave this room. Is that clear?" Nezu seemed to be scanning his body language and facial expression, but didn't do anything more as Shota gave him a small yet sharp nod in response. "What you're about to see is a national secret. It is not to be taken lightly, and the fact that Midoriya apparently knows is going to have to be taken into consideration later." Without saying anything else, Nezu pushed for the video to continue playing, only for Midoriya to say exactly 2 words before abruptly stopping himself. It took Shota a few moments to understand why Midoriya had stopped so abruptly, and it was first once he noticed the stare Midoriya was giving All Might that he looked over and noticed the smoke that soon was all but obscuring the man from the view of the cameras. Looking over at Nezu, the rat seemed intrigued and almost a bit excited, a combination that never meant anything good, but Before he could gather his thoughts enough to ask what was happening, the smoke cleared, and All Might was gone. In his place was a skeletal man, maybe half, if not a third, of the hero's size, and it took Shota a second to realize that that was indeed the number one hero. Shota showed Nezu a look that quite clearly conveyed, "Explain." And Nezu just smiled his usual polite smile back. The same one he used with parents and the HPSC, and ignored him, looking pointedly back at the screen and not acknowledging Shota's very obvious question. But it didn't matter for long, because his thoughts came to an abrupt halt soon after. "Now that you've seen me like this, young man, I hope you'll understand to not go posting about it online, not even accidentally." Of course, the number one hero would be more concerned about how this would impact himself than how it would impact the clearly traumatized kid in front of him. No wonder Midori had been so hesitant to talk about his meeting with him the night before. He was probably terrified of saying something he shouldn't have and disappointing the symbol of peace. On the video, All Might proceeded to show off an injury at his side that Shota had known nothing about, but one look over at the rat told him he was aware of. The hero continued to efficiently trauma dump on this kid, and despite being a bit impressed with the kid was so quick with knowing All Might's fights off top of his head, Shota couldn't help but get more and more worked up over how the older hero was talking. None of this was information Midori should be told, not only because it was a national secret or whatnot, but because this was earth-shattering news, and most likely one of the many reasons why the kid had been about to jump when Shota had found him. So no, I cannot simply say, "You can't be a hero without a quirk," because you can't. Oh, that was it. Shota was certainly very happy that he was an underground hero with close to no chance of meeting the number one limelight hero at any time soon, because he was not going to be responsible for his own actions if he ever happened to be in the same room as him, and he'd been a student of Nezu long enough to know that a meeting like that would garner a type of attention that he would rather prefer to avoid. They watched All Might walk away from the broken bits and pieces that were once a kid, looking like he had no idea what he had just done by opening his mouth like that. And I had watched as Midoriya crumpled onto the ground of the roof. Nezu was currently stuck in between a very peculiar pair of emotions. It was quite actually interesting in and of itself. It was possible to feel those two things at once. But here he was. He was angry, enraged that All Might would dare to talk the way he had to someone who was not only a future student of UA, but someone who was his. But he was also absolutely ecstatic. Midoriya Izuku was a conundrum, a riddle that Nezu couldn't wait to solve. He was going to have to rewatch the security footage once Aizawa hadn't left. He had to split his attention too much, having to watch for Aizawa's reactions, as well as everything happening between All Might and Midoriya. He'd caught the way Midoriya had reacted to All Might's transformation. And wasn't that interesting? Midoriya had noticed it only a couple seconds after Nezu himself had caught it, and he was willing to bet that was simply because that was when he looked up to see it. Even Aizawa had taken longer than that to understand that something was happening at all. The only reason why Midoriya would have been able to notice it so quickly was if he was aware it was going to happen. Connect that to the way he didn't even twitch at seeing Yagi-san after the transformation. Midoriya-kun had already known, had already seen it before. And if Nezu were to guess, based on what Aizawa-kun had told him of the boy's mental state, he'd say the panic Midoriya-kun had been showing was not due to him learning an earth-shattering nation's secret, but instead because he was blaming himself for making the hero reveal it in the first place. How Midoriya-kun had come to know of it in the first place was something Nezu would have to look into closely, although hopefully Midoriya-kun would be willing to just tell it himself. The guess of Toxic Chainsaw was also a plus in his book, although that book was so full of everything else so far that it really didn't add anything. There was no chance Nezu was going to let Midoriya Izuku go now. Midoriya could fail to show up at the entrance exam, and Nezu would come to hand deliver his acceptance letter to his face to make sure he received it. He could already imagine making a spot for him on his teaching staff in a few years. Maybe start proposing the idea 3 years after he's graduated. Spend the 2 following years coaxing him into the idea, thus giving him a total of 5 years to make a name for himself in the world before having him to return to UA, to Nezu. It worked with Aizawa-kun. He'd even managed to hire Yamada-san and Kayama-san as well to make the environment more comfortable for him. He'd had to look out for who Midoriya would become friends with during the next 3 years. Once All Might had left the rooftop, Midoriya was left to his despair. Nezu had let the video continue as he turned to Aizawa-kun to continue, or rather begin their conversation. And what better way to begin the conversation than to just drop another piece of important information in Aizawa-kun's lab? It's not like there would be a better time to let the man know. Well, it might have been better to tell him before, showing him the surveilling footage, but that wouldn't have been nearly as satisfying as it had been to just have Aizawa watch the footage the second he walked in the door. So, letting the video of Midoriya sitting on the rooftop playing on one screen, and without saying a word, Nezu started tapping away to make his email show up on another screen, and turn that one too, to let Aizawa read his correspondence with the HPSC agent he's been in touch with. It seems we'll have to find a way to keep Yagi-san and Midoriya as separate as possible, was all he said as he let Aizawa read through the emails, trusting that he would be able to come to the same conclusion Nezu had come to some hours ago. And if the look Aizawa gave him as he was finishing reading was any indication, he had. Nezu did not envy the stress-induced headaches he knew Aizawa was prone to as he saw the man's hand reach up to massage the bridge of his nose. There is no way to postpone this. It wasn't a question, more of a statement, but Nezu nodded in confirmation regardless. And he will be teaching heroics. Again, Nezu gave a quick nod as confirmation. Aizawa heaved a sigh and looked absolutely done with the word as he dropped to his hand and looked at Nezu with a new resolve. I will be attending any and all of All Might's lessons. Whenever as supervisor or as co-teacher, I'll let you decide. But there is no chance in hell I'll let that buffoon anywhere near my kids, and definitely not alone. After taking another look towards the screen that still showed Midoriya sitting on the roof, he added, I'm also going to need someone by my side to keep me from attacking the bastard the second I lay eyes on him. He said it with the same casual tone of voice that one would ask for an extra cup of coffee, but Nezu could see from the look in Aizawa's face that it was a serious request, and he'd make sure to keep in mind when the time would come. Nezu nodded again, drinking the rest of his long cold tea, and turned once again to look at the clock. The school day would be over in just a few minutes, and Aizawa took the silent dismissal for what it was. Nezu hadn't said all that much during their meeting, but he didn't feel he had to. Sometimes they didn't need words to communicate, and sometimes using words just made the whole ordeal more complicated than it needed to be. All Aizawa had needed to know he had gotten, and Nezu had learned quite a lot himself. He'd already known, of course, that Midori Izuku was going to be his next personal student. He'd known it ever since Majima-san forwarded the email to him a couple of days ago, but at that point there had been an if there. Midori-kun would be his personal student if he got into UA, if he applied for the analyst division, if he passed the exam. Now there was no if. Now, Nezu was willing to skip everything and just mail him Midori-kun the acceptance letter at this moment. He wanted to, but he needed patience. Not much, but enough. He went back to focus on the video footage of Midori-kun, who was still sitting on the rooftop, in the exact same place Nezu had seen him in last time he looked. The sky, really the only sign that he hadn't accidentally paused the video. He had muted the video when Aizawa-kun had started talking, not because there was a lot of sound, but because he didn't want to be listening to the ambient static or the wind that the cameras often picked up. He unmuted it, really only so that he wouldn't have to do so after going back to the beginning of the footage again. But before he had the time to do so, he heard something. It was difficult to pick up on, but here and there he would hear a sentence or a word that he was able to make out. And soon he realized Midori-kun was muttering. It took a few tries, and he had to go back and forth a bit, trying to make the audio clear enough to have a chance at properly hearing the already muffled muttering of the boy on the screen. But once he did so, Nezu could barely comprehend what he was listening to. Midori-kun was sitting there, mid-analysis, which would have been very interesting had the analysis not been about the potential media coverage of his death, had all might killed him. Talking about which journalists and which magazines might have taken the story in which directions. Truly, it would have been amazingly interesting to listen to the way he had reasoned and argued with himself to come to the conclusion he had came to. This would have been ecstatic to listen, had it not been for the dreadful and macabre subject. Merely the fact that the child was able to talk and think about things like this as if he was discussing the weather was enough to have alarm bells ringing about the potential abusive situations and relations Midori-kun might be in. Nezu continued to listen to the boy's mumblings, finding his thoughts process very interesting to follow, and he continued to watch even as the mumblings came to a stop. He did some of his own work, paying half attention to whenever something more happened with Midori-kun, but not speeding up the footage. It wasn't long before the boy sat up from where he laid down and turned to look at the sun setting on the horizon. Nezu might not be human, but he was a hero, and so he couldn't help but the gnawing feeling in his chest as he watched Midori-kun, the boy he had all but claimed as his own, despite never actually having met the kid, stand up, walk to the edge of the roof, and look down over the railing. Nezu was unable to see his face, as he was turned away from both cameras by standing by the railing, and so he didn't see the boy's facial expressions. But it wasn't too long before the kid turned around again. He was rummaging around on the rooftop, every action seemingly taking Midoricon by surprise, as if the thought of doing so occurred only a mere seconds before he did it, as if he wasn't planning on doing anything before he suddenly was, over and over again, looking surprised that he was moving. Then he was just sitting there, a notebook in his lap, pen in hand, looking ready to write, but instead just staring down at his notebook. Nothing more happened for a while, and Nezu just continued to work on his various principal duties, idly watching in his peripheral vision as the sun set in the horizon behind the boy, who just continued sitting there against the railing for the longest time. The next time the boy moved, Nezu had been considering for a while to speed up the footage. It would make the whole process easier, less time-consuming. After all, the school day ended hours ago. But Nezu prided himself on patience, and some part of him wanted to experience this at the same pace as Midoricon. He wanted to understand the boy, and that wouldn't happen without understanding the pace at which his mind worked. And so he watched as Midoricon climbed back over the railing and seemed to just stand there, contemplating and not moving. The way he was just standing meant that even just moving to adjust his position would likely be enough for the boy to slip and fall down to the pavement below. And it was the only knowledge that Aizawa had met the boy afterwards that caused him not to panic at the sight. Midoricon stood there, still, for a long time. Whether it was to gather the nerves to jump due to the second-guessing himself, or whenever the boy was just zoned out, however much the thought of that made his heart ache for the child, Nezu didn't know. But Midoricon was looking down for a long time before he suddenly looked up. Now, Nezu couldn't see the boy's face, could only see the way the head tilted upwards from behind. But if you were asked to ask Nezu, he would say the boy's body language seemed almost more confused than anything else, as if he somewhat overheard someone say that the sky was such a beautiful glowing yellow, at the same time as he was looking at the pitch-black night sky surrounding him. Nezu observed his work long forgotten, as Midoricon looked over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something. His eyes seemed to widen slightly at whatever he saw, though it was hard to tell due to the low video quality as well as bad lighting. He looked back down at the streets below him, seemingly to weigh the pros and cons of jumping, before, luckily, decided that it was not the right time to jump now after all, thus crawling back over to the safe side of the railing and sitting back down, just like he had been sitting before he had gotten up in the first place. Now, this was smart. This was an undeniable fact. If not for anything he had done, then at the very least, no one could deny it for his quirk. But Nezu was also smart enough to know that the thing that made him smart was not, in fact, his quirk. No, his quirk only gave him the brain capacity to think fast, retain memory, and gain comprehension. The thing that made him smarter than most humans was not his quirk. It was his curiosity. His need and want to understand and know everything he did not already. The way his brain lit up every time he saw or heard something that just didn't quite make sense, and the way he just has to know why. How? Why? That is why he's smart. And that is why Nezu was currently incapable of thinking about anything but the conundrum that is Midori Izuku. because as he watched the way the boy reacted to seeing Aizawa landing on a rooftop in front of him, all Nezu could think was, how? And it only continued as he watched the boy's eyes scan the man that he had no reasonable way of seeing. Not only that, but Nezu knows he saw him long before the man landed on the rooftop. And going back, Nezu is almost certain that his Aizawa is what had made the boy look up and hesitate earlier, right before he had looked over his shoulder in the direction of the approaching underground hero. Midori-kun had known the man was there, and the only sensible option of how was to eat of a quirk. And didn't that just spur his brain on more? The implications of everything he had come to know about the boy in so short time frame that he had indeed known about him. It all just shifted slightly to the left, and Nezu needed to know more. And that is it for this chapter. I'm sorry if this has some mistakes. I am tired. I'm very tired. For now, this is the last chapter that is updated. So it might take a while for me to update the next chapter because it simply doesn't exist yet. And well, I will be waiting on the author of this amazing fic. I am open to all constructive criticism, as people say, and to all pointers that you may have for me. Yeah, I really appreciate all comments, and so if you could just drop a comment to know that for a way that I know that you hear, it would really help me to motivate. And you don't have to do that. But yeah, so thanks for watching. Oh, sorry. Thanks for listening, and see you. I won't see you, but have a great night or day, and bye-bye.